The sun was blazing down on the tarmac at the private aviation terminal in Burbank, California, creating a shimmering haze that made the distant horizon look like a mirage. It was one of those perfect, bright afternoons where the sky is so blue it almost looks fake. But on the ground, the heat was heavy. It smelled of jet fuel, hot rubber, and that distinct, sterile scent of money. This wasn't the chaotic side of the airport where families argue about luggage and lines stretch out the door. This was the quiet side. The side where silence is bought by the hour. Near the main hangar, a sleek white Gulfstream G650 sat parked like a sleeping beast. It was a $90 million machine, every curve of its body designed for speed and luxury. The windows were dark, hiding the interior secrets, but the exterior alone was enough to make anyone stop and stare. It reflected the sunlight so sharply it hurt to look at it directly. This was the kind of plane that belonged to someone who didn't just want to fly, they wanted to own the air. Standing at the bottom of the stairs leading up to the jet was a woman named Veronica. She was the kind of person who commanded a room without even trying, mostly because everyone around her was terrified of making a mistake. She wore a pristine white pantsuit that seemed to defy the dust and dirt of the outdoors, and her sunglasses were large enough to hide her eyes, though not her impatience. She was checking her watch, tapping the face of it with a manicured fingernail. To Veronica, time wasn't just passing, it was slipping away, wasted. Behind her stood a small army of people. There was a personal assistant holding a tablet so tightly his knuckles were white, a security guard scanning the empty perimeter with unnecessary intensity, and a flight attendant waiting with a tray of sparkling water that no one was drinking. They were all waiting for one thing, the signal to go. But Veronica wasn't moving. She was just standing there, absorbing the power of her machine, looking out at the airfield. On the other side of the tarmac, about 50 yards away, the scene was completely different. There was no entourage. There was no security detail. There was just one man, walking with a steady, unhurried pace toward a much smaller prop plane. It was a chartered flight, nothing fancy, just a way to get from point A to point B. The man was Keanu Reeves. Even in a place filled with wealthy executives, he stood out, but not because of his clothes. He was wearing a simple pair of dark jeans, a worn-out t-shirt that looked like it had seen better days, and a leather jacket that had softened with age. His hair was messy, pushed back by the wind or just by his hands. He didn't look like a movie star. He looked like a guy who might be on his way to a mechanic's shop. What really caught the eye, however, was what he was carrying in his right hand. It wasn't a designer leather bag or a sleek aluminum briefcase. It was a toolbox, and it wasn't just any toolbox. This thing looked like it had survived a war. It was a heavy, red metal box, covered in scratches that went deep into the paint. There were dents on the corners, as if it had been dropped off a truck or used as a hammer in a pinch. The latch on the front was rusty, and someone had wrapped a thick piece of black electrical tape around the handle to keep it from digging into the palm. There was even a faded sticker peeling off the side, a remnant from a band that was popular decades ago. To anyone else, it looked like junk. To Keanu, it was the most important thing he had packed. He walked toward the small plane, the weight of the box obvious in the way his shoulder dipped slightly. He didn't have a porter to take it from him. He didn't ask for help. He just carried it, his boots crunching softly on the asphalt. When he reached the pilot of the small prop plane, a guy in a bomber jacket who was leaning against the wing, Keanu smiled. It was a genuine smile, the kind that crinkles the corners of your eyes. He set the heavy toolbox down gently on the ground, as if he were putting down a sleeping baby, and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Thanks for waiting," Keanu said, his voice low and raspy. He gestured to the box. "Just need to get this stowed. It's a bit heavy." The pilot, a man named Dave who had flown plenty of celebrities in his time, just nodded and grabbed the handle. He was surprised by the weight. "Whoa, what you got in here rocks." "Clothes," Keanu laughed softly. "Tools. Just some stuff I need for a project up north. I'm fixing up an old bike, and you can't trust the rental equipment." Dave heaved the box into the cargo hold, hearing the heavy clank of metal shifting inside. He shook his head, amused. He had seen people fly with diamonds, gold bars, and even small pets in cages, but he had never seen a movie star fly with a rusty box of wrenches. Most guys in Keanu's position would have shipped the tools ahead or just bought a new set when they landed. But Keanu liked this box. It was reliable. It was broken in, just like the jacket on his back. While this quiet exchange was happening, the silence on the other side of the tarmac was broken by the sharp click of heels. Veronica had started walking toward her jet, her entourage scrambling to keep up. She moved like a shark through water, smooth and dangerous. She was on a call, her voice sharp and authoritative as she barked orders into her phone about stock prices and deadlines. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through the warm air. "I don't care about the projections. I want results. If the board isn't happy when I land in New York, you're going to have a very big problem." She hung up the phone abruptly, shoving it into her pocket. She paused at the bottom of the stairs to her Gulf Stream, taking a deep breath of the hot air. She adjusted her sunglasses and looked around, scanning the area as if she owned the pavement itself. That was when her eyes landed on the scene across the way. She saw the small prop plane. She saw the pilot wiping his hands. And then she saw Keanu. Veronica was smart. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone knew who he was. But in her world, celebrity was just another form of currency, and she wasn't impressed by currency that didn't come with $1 billion valuation. She watched him for a moment, tilting her head. He was bent over, checking the tire pressure on the small plane, completely unconcerned with the image he was projecting. He looked common. Then, her eyes drifted to the toolbox sitting on the tarmac next to the cargo hatch. The pilot had just pulled it out to adjust something behind it. The red paint was chipped. The tape on the handle was fraying. It looked out of place in the pristine environment of the private airport. It looked like a piece of trash that had blown in from a scrapyard. A sneer curled the corner of Veronica's lip. It was a small expression, a subconscious reaction to something she felt didn't belong in her line of sight. To her, the toolbox wasn't just a container for wrenches. It was a symbol of failure. If you had money, you bought nice things. If you had power, you didn't carry your own luggage in a beaten-up box. You paid people to do that for you. "Is that him?" Veronica asked, not looking at her assistant but keeping her eyes locked on the man in the leather jacket. The assistant, whose name was Brian, glanced over. He pushed his glasses up his nose. "Yes, ma'am. That is Keanu Reeves? I think he's heading to a film location or maybe a vacation." "Humph," Veronica grunted. She crossed her arms. "He looks like a mechanic." Brian didn't know what to say. He laughed nervously, a short, forced sound. "Well, he likes motorcycles. I guess he works on them himself." Veronica watched as Keanu picked up the toolbox again. The muscles in his arm flexed, straining against the weight of the metal. He grunted slightly, a quiet sound of effort, and hoisted it into the plane. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't looking around for sympathy. He was just doing the work. For some reason, this annoyed Veronica even more. She had spent her entire life building an empire so she would never have to strain herself like that. To see someone who had the resources to live like a king choosing to live like a pauper was baffling to her. It seemed insulting, almost. "It's ridiculous," she said, mostly to herself, but loud enough for Brian to hear. "Look at that thing. It's falling apart. Why would someone with that kind of money hold onto junk? It's embarrassing." She started walking up the stairs to her jet, her heels clacking rhythmically against the metal. The cabin attendant was waiting at the top with a glass of champagne. "Good afternoon, Miss Sterling," the attendant said with a bow. "We are ready for departure." Veronica stepped into the cool, air-conditioned cabin. It smelled of expensive leather and fresh flowers. The seats were wide enough to sleep in, covered in soft cream fabric. There were screens built into the walls, and a console that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. Everything was digital, everything was new, everything was perfect. She sat down in her designated seat and sighed, feeling the tension leave her shoulders as she sank into the luxury. But even as she relaxed, her mind kept drifting back to the image of that red toolbox. It bothered her. It was like a splinter in her mind. It represented a chaos she couldn't control. She liked things that were shiny, automated, and predictable. That red box was unpredictable. It was messy. It was real. Outside the window, the ground crew was finalizing the preparations for the Gulf Stream. The massive engines were silent, waiting for the command to start. In the distance, the prop plane's engine sputtered to life. It was a rough, loud sound, a coughing roar that vibrated through the air. Veronica winced at the noise. It was so uncivilized. She looked out the window just in time to see the prop plane taxiing away. She could see the back of Keanu's head through the small window. He was just sitting there, likely in a cramped seat that didn't recline, next to a toolbox held together by tape. She shook her head slowly. "Poor guy," she muttered, taking a sip of her champagne. "He has no idea what real luxury is." She leaned back and closed her eyes, picturing the smooth flight ahead. She would be in New York in a few hours, fresh and ready to conquer the boardroom. There would be no turbulence, no noise, and certainly no heavy lifting. She pressed a button on her armrest, and the window shade slid down automatically, blocking out the bright California sun and the view of the tarmac. In the cockpit of her jet, the pilot was running through the pre-flight checklists. Everything was green. The systems were online. The fuel was loaded. It was a state-of-the-art machine, a marvel of modern engineering that cost more than most people made in 10 lifetimes. There was no reason to suspect that anything would go wrong. Machines like this didn't break down. They didn't fail. They just performed, exactly like they were told. The pilot signaled the ground crew. They pulled the chocks away from the wheels. The silence of the cabin was absolute, a peaceful vacuum sealed off from the world. Veronica smiled, feeling superior. She had won the game. She was sitting in a throne room in the sky, while the actor was bumping along in a noisy tin can with his rusty tools. But the tarmac still held the heat of the day, and sometimes, heat can do strange things to electronics. Sometimes, the most expensive machines are the most fragile, while the old, battered things just keep going. As the pilot reached for the start button, the air in the cockpit felt heavy, charged with a static tension that no one could see. Veronica adjusted her silk scarf, completely unaware that her smooth, perfect world was about to hit a very hard, very unexpected stop. She was thinking about money, about power, and about the difference between the people who have them and the people who don't. She didn't realize that in about 30 seconds, the only thing that would matter wasn't the price tag on the plane, but whether it could actually get off the ground. The heat on the tarmac seemed to intensify as the afternoon wore on, the air shimmering above the concrete. Veronica stood near the open door of her Gulfstream, but she hadn't boarded yet. She was holding a glass of iced water, condensation dripping onto her manicured fingers, but her attention was fixated across the tarmac. She just couldn't let it go. The sight of that battered red toolbox was like a speck of dust on a pristine mirror, tiny, but impossible to ignore. To Veronica, everything in life was a reflection of status. The clothes you wore, the car you drove, the phone you held in your hand, they were all signals to the rest of the world about where you stood on the ladder of success. Seeing a man who was worth millions walking around with a rusty, broken-down box of tools didn't make sense to her. It felt like a violation of the natural order. If you had the money, you showed it. That was the rule. And seeing someone break that rule so blatantly annoyed her more than she cared to admit. "Brian," she said, turning to her assistant who was busy furiously typing on his tablet. "I think I need some fresh air before we get stuck in that tube for 5 hours. Let's take a little walk." Brian looked up, startled. "But ma'am, the flight plan is filed. We should really be taking off within the next 10 minutes to beat the headwinds." "Relax," Veronica snapped, though she kept her voice smooth. "The jet isn't going anywhere without me. Come along." She started walking toward the other side of the ramp, her heels clicking with authority. Brian scrambled to follow, signaling frantically for the security guard to trail behind them at a respectful distance. As they moved across the asphalt, the noise of the ground crew faded slightly, replaced by the low hum of the prop plane's engine as it idled. Keanu was just finishing up. He had secured the toolbox in the cargo hold and was now double-checking the tie-downs to make sure nothing shifted during the flight. He was sweating, his t-shirt sticking to his back, but he looked comfortable. He was in his element. To him, the mechanics of a plane or a motorcycle were soothing. There was logic in nuts and bolts, a honesty in how things fit together. It was a far cry from the fake smiles and backroom deals of Hollywood. Veronica stopped a few feet away, close enough to be heard but far enough to avoid any accidental contact with the grime of the tarmac. She watched him for a moment, sipping her water, analyzing him like he was a strange specimen in a zoo. "You know," she called out, her voice cutting through the air, sharp and clear. "I almost didn't recognize you without the CGI and the makeup." Keanu paused. He wiped his hands on a rag he pulled from his back pocket and turned around. When he saw Veronica and her little parade of followers, he didn't look annoyed. He just looked surprised. He offered a polite nod, his face open and friendly. "Hi there," he said. "Yeah, I'm off the clock today. Just trying to get to Montana." Veronica stepped closer, pointing the rim of her glass toward the cargo hold of the small plane. "I couldn't help but notice that thing you just loaded. Is that your luggage? Please tell me you're helping the pilot move something and it doesn't actually belong to you." Keanu glanced back at the plane, then looked at her. A small, amused smile touched his lips. He knew exactly what she was doing. He had dealt with people like her before, people who measured worth in price tags. Usually, he would just brush it off, but something about her tone, that extra bit of bite, made him want to stand his ground gently. "No, that's mine," he said. "It's my toolbox. I've had it for years. It's got everything I need." Veronica let out a short, incredulous laugh. She looked at Brian, as if to say, "Can you believe this?" Then she turned back to Keanu, shaking her head. "You're kidding, right? You fly private, don't you? I assume you can afford it." "I do sometimes," Keanu replied calmly. He leaned against the strut of the small wing, totally relaxed. "But I just like taking care of my own stuff. This box has been with me through a lot of projects. It's reliable." Reliable? Veronica walked up to the cargo door, peering in at the red metal box with disdain. "It looks like it's been dragged behind a car on the highway. The tape is coming unraveled. It's rusty. I'm honestly surprised the TSA let that hunk of junk on the tarmac. It looks like it belongs in a dumpster, not on a plane." Keanu didn't get angry. He didn't even frown. He just looked at the toolbox with genuine affection. "It's seen better days, I'll give you that. But the hinges still work. The lock holds. And the tools inside are the best ones for the job. I don't need it to look pretty. I just need it to work when I open it." Veronica scoffed. She took a step closer, invading his personal space slightly, testing to see if he would back down. He didn't. He just stood there, solid as a rock. "That is such a waste," she said, her voice dripping with judgment. "You have the resources to buy the best equipment in the world. You could have a toolbox made of titanium with gold-plated wrenches. Instead, you choose to carry around garbage. It's practically an insult to your own success. If you're going to be rich, at least act like it. Why hold on to something that's broken?" "It's not broken," Keanu said softly. "It's just worn in." "There's a difference," she snapped. "One is class. The other is just sad." She turned her nose up, looking down at the dusty ground. "I suppose that's the problem with your generation of actors. You get so caught up in trying to be real that you forget to be excellent. You settle for scraps." Brian, standing a few feet behind, looked uncomfortable. He shuffled his feet, staring at his shoes. He knew his boss was crossing a line, but he also knew that saying anything would only make it worse. The security guard stared straight ahead, pretending to be deaf. Keanu looked at Veronica for a long moment. He saw the tension in her jaw, the way she gripped her glass, the desperate need she had to prove she was better than him. He didn't see a villain, he just saw someone who was very unhappy. He decided to let it slide. He wasn't going to win an argument with a wall, and he wasn't going to ruin his day by getting into a fight on a hot runway. He pushed himself off the wing strut. "Well, I guess we see things differently," he said, his voice level and kind. "But like I said, this old box has never let me down. Sometimes, the new fancy stuff has too many moving parts. Too many things that can go wrong. Simple is good." He reached out and patted the side of the plane's fuselage. "Old things usually work when you need them to. That's all that matters to me." Veronica rolled her eyes so hard it looked painful. She let out a dramatic sigh, checking her imaginary watch again. Philosophy from a mechanic. How quaint. "Look, I have a flight to catch. I have a meeting in New York with people who actually value their time." She turned on her heel, her hair whipping around her face. "Enjoy your rust bucket, Keanu. And enjoy the noise. I'll be in the silence of a pressurized cabin, sipping champagne, trying to forget this entire conversation." Keanu just smiled. "Have a safe flight," he called after her. "Seriously, fly safe." Veronica didn't look back. She kept walking, her heels striking the pavement with angry precision. She felt flushed, her heart beating a little faster than normal. She wasn't sure why she had gotten so worked up. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was just the sheer absurdity of the situation. But mostly, it was because he hadn't cared what she thought. That was the one thing her money couldn't buy: respect from people who didn't want anything from her. And that annoyed her more than anything. As she walked back toward her gleaming white Gulf Stream, she passed the ground crew who were fueling her jet. "Make sure it's perfect," she barked at them. "I don't want any issues. I want to be in the air in 5 minutes." "Yes, ma'am," the lead mechanic shouted, saluting. Veronica climbed the stairs to her plane, her mood dark. Brian followed silently, keeping his head down. As they reached the top of the stairs, the flight attendant was waiting with a fresh glass of champagne and a cool towel. "Is everything all right, Miss Sterling?" the attendant asked gently, sensing the tension. Veronica grabbed the towel and pressed it against the back of her neck. "It is now," she said sharply. "Just get us out of here. I've had enough of this place." She walked into the cabin and sank into her plush leather seat. It was cool inside, perfectly climate-controlled to exactly 70 degrees. The silence was heavy and luxurious. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to wash away the image of that dirty red toolbox and the man who treasured it. "People," she muttered to herself, taking a long sip of champagne. "They have no class." Outside the window, the ground crew disconnected the fuel hose. The pilot, sitting in the cockpit, ran through the final checks. Everything looked green. The weather was clear. The route was programmed. It was the perfect setup for a smooth flight. Veronica leaned forward and pressed the button to close the main cabin door. With a soft hiss of hydraulics, the door sealed shut, locking out the noise of the tarmac and the world below. She was alone in her bubble of perfection, surrounded by technology that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. She felt safe. She felt superior. She felt like she had won. She picked up a magazine from the side pocket, flipping through it without really seeing the pages. Her mind was already in New York, thinking about the deal she was going to close. She forgot about Keanu Reeves almost instantly. He was just a bump in the road, a momentary annoyance on her path to greatness. In the cockpit, the pilot cleared his throat. "Tower, this is Gulfstream N1VS, ready for departure." "Copy, N1VS," the air traffic controller replied over the radio. "You are cleared for taxi to runway 224 left. Winds are calm." "Copy, runway 224 left," the pilot said. He reached for the throttle. His hand was steady, his movements practiced. He pushed the levers forward, expecting the familiar, powerful surge of the engines. He expected the vibration that would signal the raw power of the twin jets coming to life. But as the engines spooled up, something felt off. Instead of the smooth, rising whine of the turbines, there was a sputter. A cough. A sound that no pilot ever wants to hear on a brand new, $90 million aircraft. Veronica looked up from her magazine. She felt a shudder run through the floor of the cabin. It wasn't the steady rumble of takeoff. It was a violent, shaking hiccup. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the hum of the air conditioning died. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. "What was that?" Veronica said, her voice tight. She looked at the flight attendant, whose face had gone pale. "Why did the lights go out?" In the cockpit, warning lights were flashing like a disco. The main display screens were blank. The pilot was frantically tapping switches, his heart rate spiking. "Come on," he whispered to the plane. "Come on, baby. Start." Nothing happened. The plane was dead. The most advanced piece of machinery on the runway was currently no more useful than the rusty toolbox Veronica had just mocked. The silence that fell over the cabin was heavier than the noise had been. It was the kind of silence that feels physical, like a heavy blanket thrown over everyone at once. 1 second, the air conditioning had been humming a soft, steady tune, and the next, it was gone. The low vibration of the engines, which usually felt like a gentle massage, vanished completely. The Gulf Stream was suddenly just a heavy metal shell sitting on hot concrete. Veronica sat frozen in her leather seat, her hand still halfway to her mouth with the champagne glass. She looked around, waiting for the hum to return. Surely, this was just a hiccup. A momentary blip in the system. These things happened, right? Even in the most expensive cars, the engine sometimes stumbled before catching. But the seconds ticked by, and the silence stretched on. Suddenly, the main cabin lights died, plunging them into a dim, gray twilight. A heartbeat later, the emergency floor lights kicked on. They weren't the bright, clean lights that made the cabin look like a high-end office. They were red, dim, and ominous. They cast long, creepy shadows against the walls, turning the luxury interior into something that looked like a scene from a submarine movie. Brian. Veronica's voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness. "What is going on? Why did the lights go out?" Brian, who had been sitting nervously across the aisle, dropped his tablet. It clattered onto the thick carpet. I don't know, ma'am. Maybe a surge. The pilot will fix it." He pressed the call button for the flight attendant, but nothing happened. No soft chime, no light turning on above his head. The button was dead. Veronica felt a prickle of sweat on the back of her neck. It wasn't from the heat, though the cabin was already starting to feel stuffy without the air conditioning, but from the first, tiny finger of fear scratching at her mind. She hated losing control. She hated not knowing what was happening next. And right now, she was trapped in a dead tube. The cockpit door opened. The pilot stepped out. He was a man with gray hair and usually a very calm demeanor, but right now, he looked pale. His forehead was glistening with sweat, and his eyes were wide. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice tight. He was trying to sound professional, but there was a waver in it he couldn't hide. "I need you to remain calm. We are experiencing a technical difficulty." "Technical difficulty?" Veronica snapped, her fear turning instantly into anger. Anger was her shield. "Define technical difficulty. Why aren't we moving? Why is it dark in here?" "We had a power surge when I initiated the start sequence," the pilot explained, gripping the door frame. "It tripped the main breaker. I'm trying to reset the auxiliary power unit, but the system isn't responding. The avionics are completely blacked out." "English," Veronica demanded. "Can we fly or not?" "Not right now," the pilot admitted. "The computer is locked. It won't accept any inputs. It's a full electrical grounding fault. I've never seen anything like it on a new model." He didn't add that he was terrified. In the old days, planes had dials and cables. If the electricity failed, you could still fly the plane manually. But this jet, it was a flying computer. Without the computers, the engines wouldn't stay lit, the controls wouldn't move, and the flaps wouldn't adjust. It was a $90 million paperweight. "Fix it," Veronica said, pointing a manicured finger at the floor. "I don't pay you to tell me problems. I pay you to have solutions." The pilot swallowed hard. I'm going to have to go outside and check the external relay switch manually. The ground crew is on their way. He turned and hurried back to the cockpit to grab his flashlight, leaving the cabin door open. Through the opening, Veronica could see the dim glow of the instrument panel, usually a galaxy of green and blue lights, now as black as a stone. Outside the window, the scene was chaotic. The ground crew, who had been casually leaning against their equipment a few minutes ago, were now running. Veronica watched through the darkened glass as three men in bright orange vests sprinted toward the plane. They were dragging a heavy power cart, a machine designed to jump-start the aircraft. "Look," Brian said, pointing with a shaky hand. "They're bringing the power cart. They'll hook it up, and we'll be fine." Veronica watched, her breath hitching slightly. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. She watched the lead mechanic plug a thick, heavy cable into the belly of the jet. He gave a thumbs-up signal to the flight deck. Inside, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, static-free but weak because of the limited backup power. "We are connected to external power. Attempting reboot now." Veronica waited. She stared at the ceiling lights. Nothing happened. The red emergency light stayed on. The air remained still. The silence continued. Outside, the mechanic was shaking his head. He was unplugging the cable and plugging it back in, slamming the connection home as if brute force could fix the electronic gremlins. He was talking into his radio, his face twisted in confusion. He ran to a panel on the side of the plane and popped it open, shining a flashlight inside. "What are they doing?" Veronica whispered, leaning so close to the window her breath fogged the glass. "Why isn't it working?" I think the main surge damaged the intake port," Brian said, his voice cracking. He knew a little bit about cars, and he was guessing. "If the computer thinks there's a short, it won't let the power in. It's a safety lockout." Veronica closed her eyes. This couldn't be happening. She had a board meeting. She had a schedule. She was Veronica Sterling. The universe didn't just shut down on her. Outside, the mechanic was now banging on the side of the plane with the heel of his fist. It was a desperate move. He was yelling something to the other crew members. They huddled around the open panel, scratching their heads. One of them pulled out a laptop and tried to plug it into a diagnostic port, but even that wasn't getting a response. The plane's brain was fried. The pilot came back out of the cockpit. He looked even worse than before. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The external power can't get through. The system has locked itself down hard. We need to manually reset the physical bypass switch located behind the landing gear assembly. It's a safety feature for fires, but it's stuck." "Stuck?" Veronica repeated. "How can a switch be stuck?" "It's a switch. It's an old mechanical switch," the pilot said, wiping sweat from his eyes. "It hasn't been used in years. It's rusted or seized. We need to get in there and force it, but the panel covering it, the screws are stripped. We can't get a grip with the standard bits." Veronica stared at him. "You're telling me that a $90 million aircraft is grounded because of a rusty screw?" The pilot nodded miserably. "Essentially, yes. We need a tool that can grip a stripped screw head and get some torque. But my guys, they only have the standard issue kit. Their electric screwdrivers are dead because the cart is acting up. And the manual wrenches they have are too rounded off. They're slipping." Veronica stood up. She felt dizzy, not from the lack of air, but from the sheer absurdity of it all. She walked to the window. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long, orange shadows across the runway. In the distance, she could see the small prop plane. It was still there. She squinted. The prop plane hadn't taken off yet. It was sitting at the end of the runway, waiting for clearance. She could see the pilot, the guy in the bomber jacket, standing near the wing. And she could see Keanu. He was leaning against the landing gear, talking to the pilot. He looked so relaxed. He looked like he didn't have a care in the world. Veronica gritted her teeth. Here she was, trapped in a dark, airless tin can because her superior technology was too stupid to let a little power surge go. And over there was the man with the rusty toolbox, the man she had mocked, probably about to fly off into the sunset without a single problem. The irony tasted bitter in her mouth. "We have to do something," Veronica said, turning back to the pilot. "Call someone. Get another plane. Get a helicopter. I don't care. Get me off this thing." "We can't, ma'am," the pilot said gently. "The tower has us grounded. You can't move a dead jet. We have to fix it here or wait for a tow truck, which will take hours." The situation felt hopeless. The flight attendant was now opening the emergency exits just to let a breeze in, creating a cross-draft that rustled the magazines but did little to cool the tempers inside. Veronica sat back down, her face in her hands. She could hear the mechanics outside swearing loudly as another tool slipped and skittered across the tarmac. They were helpless. The modern world, with all its gadgets and wireless updates and smart screens, had failed her. It had crashed. And suddenly, in the quiet of her own mind, she remembered what Keanu had said. Old things usually work when you need them to. She had laughed at him. She had sneered at his taped-up toolbox. She had told him that holding onto broken things was sad. But now, looking at the blank instrument panel and the useless laptop screens, she wondered if he was right. Maybe the new stuff wasn't better. Maybe it was just more complicated ways to break. Outside, the lead mechanic threw his hands up in the air and kicked the tire of the jet in frustration. He walked away from the plane, pulling out his radio, probably calling for a specialized crew from the maintenance hangar. They were stuck. Veronica looked out the window again. The prop plane was turning onto the runway. It was moving. It was leaving. She felt a strange pang of something regret envy. She watched the small plane accelerate, its engine roaring steadily. It wasn't quiet, it wasn't fancy, but it was working. But then, the prop plane slowed down. It pulled off to the side of the runway, near a service road. It wasn't taking off either. Why had it stopped? Through the fading light, Veronica saw a figure get out of the prop plane. It was the pilot. He was pointing toward Veronica's jet. And then, the other figure jumped out. It was Keanu. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He just jogged over to the back of the prop plane, opened the cargo hatch, and lifted out that heavy, red, battered toolbox. He swung it up onto his shoulder with a practiced motion, balancing the weight easily. Then, with the pilot leading the way, he started walking across the darkening tarmac. Straight toward her. Veronica leaned forward, her nose almost touching the glass. "What is he doing?" she whispered. Brian peered over her shoulder. Is that coming here?" The pilot of the Gulfstream saw them approaching too. He opened the main door and leaned out, squinting into the twilight. He saw the red box, and for the first time in 20 minutes, a look of hope crossed his face. The mechanic on the ground saw them too. He waved his arms, shouting, Hey! You can't come over here. This is a secure area. But the prop pilot waved back, pointing at the red box and yelling something that the wind carried away. The mechanic stopped waving. He looked at the red box, then at his own useless equipment. He stepped aside. Veronica watched as Keanu Reeves, the man she had just insulted, walked right up to her broken, multi-million-dollar jet with a toolbox held together by tape. The absurdity of the moment was so huge she almost laughed out loud. The world had turned upside down. The fancy technology was dead. The only chance she had of getting to New York tonight was currently walking toward her on a pair of scuffed boots, carrying a box of rusty wrenches. The sky was turning a deep shade of purple as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the runway. The air was cooling down, but inside the Gulf Stream, the temperature was rising steadily. Without the air conditioning, the cabin had become a greenhouse. The air was stale and smelled faintly of nervous sweat and expensive perfume. Veronica was standing at the top of the stairs that led down to the tarmac. She had pushed past the flight attendant, unable to sit in the dark any longer. She needed to see what was happening. She needed to know if she was going to be stuck in this metal tube all night. She watched through the open door as the two figures approached. The prop plane pilot, Dave, was walking fast, waving his hands to get the attention of the ground crew. Walking beside him was Keanu. He had that heavy red toolbox balanced on one shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. The lead mechanic for the Gulf Stream, a big man named Mike who was usually covered in grease from head to toe, saw them coming. He looked confused and annoyed. He was already stressed out, and the last thing he needed was some actor playing mechanic. "Hey!" Mike shouted, stepping in front of them as they got close to the wheel of the massive jet. "You can't be here. This is a secured area. We're dealing with a critical electrical failure." Dave didn't back down. He pointed at Keanu. "Mike, this guy has tools. Real tools. Not that battery-powered junk you guys are using. He can help." Mike looked at the red box, then at Keanu. He scoffed. "Look, buddy, I appreciate the gesture, but this isn't a Harley-Davidson. This is a G650. It's a flying computer. You can't fix a software lockout with a hammer." "It's not a software lockout anymore," Keanu said. His voice was calm, cutting through Mike's panic. "Dave told me. It's the mechanical bypass relay. The panel is seized, right, and the power is down so you can't use the drills." Mike blinked. He looked at Keanu with a little more respect, surprised that he understood the situation. "Yeah. The screwheads are stripped. We tried every bit we have. Without power tools to get some torque in there, we can't crack it open to reset the switch." "Let me take a look," Keanu said. He didn't wait for permission. He walked past Mike and set the toolbox down on the asphalt. The sound of the heavy metal hitting the ground was solid and reassuring. Keanu knelt beside the open panel where Mike had been working. Veronica watched from the top of the stairs. She felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her hoped he would fail, just to prove that money and technology really were superior. But a bigger, desperate part of her hoped he knew what he was doing. She gripped the handrail tightly, her knuckles turning white. Keanu flipped the latches on his toolbox. It made that familiar, heavy clunk sound. He lifted the lid. Mike peeked over his shoulder, expecting to see a mess of rusty nails and junk. What he saw made his eyes widen. The inside of the box was immaculate. Every tool had its place in a foam cutout. There were wrenches polished to a shine, sockets of every size, screwdrivers with perfectly aligned tips, and heavy-duty pliers. It wasn't a junk pile, it was a surgeon's kit for machines. "Nice set," Mike muttered, unable to help himself. "Thanks," Keanu said quietly. He didn't gloat. He just reached in and selected a tool. It was a pair of vice grips, the kind with jagged teeth that could bite into almost anything. He also grabbed a heavy rubber mallet and a flathead screwdriver with a thick, reinforced shank. "The screw is stripped," Keanu said, examining the panel. "So we can't turn it with a screwdriver. We have to make the screw turn by force." He positioned the vice grips on the screw head, tightening the handle until the metal groaned under the pressure. He leaned in, putting his weight behind it, but the screw wouldn't budge. Years of exposure to high altitude and temperature changes had essentially welded the metal in place. "It's tight," Keanu grunted. He sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. "Mike, I need you to hold this flashlight right here." "I need both hands." Mike nodded. He dropped his own useless tools and grabbed the heavy flashlight, holding the beam steady on the tiny screw. Veronica leaned forward, captivated. It was like watching a documentary, but it was happening right below her feet. She saw the muscles in Keanu's forearm tense up as he gripped the vice grips again. He wasn't just using his hands, he was using his whole body, bracing his foot against the landing gear strut for leverage. He pulled. Nothing. He adjusted the grip, biting his lip in concentration. He hit the handle of the vice grips with the rubber mallet, thud, 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 trying to shock the metal loose. "Come on," he whispered. Veronica found herself holding her breath. She looked at the sleek white paint of the plane, the millions of dollars of engineering, and then at the man on the ground with the hammer. It was such a basic, primitive scene. Man versus metal. Suddenly, Keanu stopped. He looked at the screw, then reached back into his box. This time he pulled out a small can of penetrating oil and a sturdy chisel. "Sometimes you have to convince it," Keanu said to Mike. He sprayed a little oil on the seized screw. The smell of chemicals drifted up to Veronica. It was an industrial smell, harsh and real, completely different from the lavender scent in the cabin. Then, he positioned the chisel against the edge of the screw head at an angle. It was a risky move. If he slipped, he could damage the panel permanently. If he broke the screw off, they would be grounded for days. "Steady light," Keanu said. He raised the hammer. Clang. He struck the chisel. The metal rang out. He hit it again. Clang. The screw moved a fraction of an inch. "It's moving!" Mike shouted, unable to contain his excitement. "It's turning!" Keanu didn't stop. He worked with a rhythm now. Adjust the chisel, hit the hammer. Adjust, hit. Clang, clang, clang. Each impact drove the screw around, slowly but surely. He was carving a new path for the screw, forcing it to obey the laws of physics. Veronica watched his face. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't performing. He was just working. There was a dirt smudge on his cheek now, and his white t-shirt was gray with dust. He looked nothing like the polished celebrities she saw at parties. He looked like a worker. A man who solved problems. With one final, heavy blow, the screw spun freely. Keanu dropped the hammer and grabbed the edge of the metal panel with his fingers. He pulled. The panel came off with a screech of metal, exposing the inner workings of the landing gear assembly. There, covered in a fine layer of dust, was the emergency bypass switch. It was a simple red toggle, the kind you might find on a lawnmower, buried behind a wall of wires and sensors. "There it is," Keanu said, breathless. He reached in, wrapped his hand around the switch, and looked up at Mike. "You ready?" Mike nodded frantically. "Yes." "Do it." Keanu flipped the switch. Click. It was a small sound, barely audible over the wind. But for a second, nothing happened. Veronica felt her heart sink. "Did it work?" she whispered to the empty air. And then, a hum started deep inside the belly of the plane. It was low at first, like a sleeping giant waking up. The lights on the exterior flickered and then blazed to life. Inside the cabin, Veronica heard the ding of the system rebooting. The air conditioning vents let out a hiss as cool air began to flow once more. Mike let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the tarmac. "Yes. We have power. Auxiliary power is online." Keanu stayed on his knees for a moment, wiping his greasy hands on his jeans. He took a deep breath, looking at the switch he had just tripped. He closed the panel back up. It wouldn't be perfect without the screw, but it would hold for the flight, and stood up slowly. His knees popped audibly. He picked up his tools, dropping the vice grips and the chisel back into their slots in the red box. He snapped the lid shut with a satisfying click. Up on the stairs, Veronica felt a wave of relief wash over her, so strong it made her knees weak. The crisis was over. Her meeting was saved. Her power was restored. But as she looked down at the man standing there, covered in dirt and grease, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt small. She looked at the shiny white jet, a marvel of modern engineering that had been defeated by a single rusty screw. And she looked at the beat-up red toolbox, full of old-fashioned, heavy tools, that had just saved the day. Keanu looked up and saw her watching him. He didn't smile smugly. He didn't ask for a reward. He just nodded at her, a simple acknowledgement. He bent down to pick up the toolbox, hoisting it back onto his shoulder. Mike was already on the radio, yelling at the tower to update the status. The flight attendant came to the door, beaming. "Miss Sterling. We have power. The pilot is starting the engines. We can go." Veronica gripped the rail. She looked at Keanu, who was already turning to walk away. He was going back to his prop plane. He was going to leave, just like that. "Wait," Veronica said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the quiet excitement of the restart, it carried. Keanu stopped and turned back. He looked up at her, his face calm and waiting. Veronica took a deep breath. She wanted to say thank you. She wanted to apologize for what she said earlier. She wanted to offer him a ride on her jet, to buy him a new toolbox, to give him something, anything, to balance the scales. But the words stuck in her throat. Her pride was a hard knot that she couldn't untie. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, she didn't see someone below her. She saw someone who was better than her. Not because of money, or fame, or power. But because he had something she didn't. "Your toolbox," Veronica said, her voice sounding a little shaky. It worked." Keanu smiled. It was a tired smile, but it reached his eyes. "Old things usually work when you need them to," he said, repeating the words he had told her before. But this time, they didn't sound like an excuse. They sounded like the truth. "You have a safe flight now," Keanu added. He adjusted the strap of the toolbox on his shoulder and turned away. "Get to New York. Close your deal." He walked off into the twilight, back toward the small prop plane where Dave was waiting. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for applause. He was just done. Veronica watched him go until he disappeared into the shadows of the hangar. The engines of her jet roared to life behind her, a smooth, powerful sound that promised to take her anywhere she wanted to go. But she stood there for a long moment, listening to the fading sound of his boots on the pavement, realizing that the most valuable thing on this entire airfield had just walked away from her in a red box held together by tape. The heavy door of the Gulf Stream hissed shut, sealing Veronica back inside her quiet, temperature-controlled world. The sound of the latch engaging was final, like the closing of a coffin or a vault. For a moment, she just stood there in the aisle, her hand resting on the cool leather of a seat back. The air inside was already crisp and clean, circulating perfectly through the vents, erasing the smell of the tarmac and the scent of oil that had clung to her clothes during the brief moment the door was open. Miss Sterling, the flight attendant's voice was tentative. "We are cleared for takeoff. The pilot says we are third in line. You can take your seat whenever you are ready." Veronica nodded slowly. She didn't speak. She moved like a sleepwalker toward her usual spot in the center of the cabin. Brian was already buckled in, his laptop open, typing furiously to make up for lost time. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with relief. "That was crazy," he whispered, leaning across the aisle. "But we're good now. The systems are green. We'll make it to New York with an hour to spare before the dinner." Veronica looked at him. She saw the excitement in his face, the rush of adrenaline that comes from cheating disaster. But she didn't feel it. She felt hollow. "Yes," she said quietly. "We're good." She sat down and fastened her seat belt. The buckle clicked with a precision sound that was too manufactured, too perfect. Outside the window, the ground crew was pulling away the equipment. She craned her neck to look back toward the tarmac, but the angle was wrong. All she could see was the endless stretch of asphalt and the dark hangars in the distance. The prop plane was gone. As the massive jet began to taxi, the movement was so smooth that Veronica wouldn't have known they were moving if she hadn't looked out the window. There was no vibration, no noise, just a gentle gliding sensation. It was exactly what she paid for. It was a magic carpet ride, detached from the messy, bumpy reality of the earth. But as they turned onto the runway and the engines spooled up for takeoff, Veronica's mind was stuck back on that patch of concrete. She saw the red toolbox. She saw the rust. She saw the tape. She looked down at her own hands. They were pale, soft, and perfectly manicured. She had never worked a day of manual labor in her life. She had never had to fix something that was broken with her own two hands. If something in her life broke, a phone, a car, a relationship, she didn't fix it. She replaced it. That was how her world worked. Everything was disposable. Everything had a price tag. Yet, sitting in this $90 million chair, she felt a sudden, sharp pang of envy. She envied Keanu. Not his money, and certainly not his fame. She didn't want to be chased by cameras or live in a smaller house. But she wanted what he had in that moment on the tarmac. She wanted that connection to reality. She wanted to own something that wasn't just shiny on the outside but hollow on the inside. She wanted to possess something that was reliable because she understood it, not because she paid someone else to manage it. The jet accelerated, pressing her back into the seat. The force was gentle, commanding. The wheels lifted off the ground, and the city of Burbank fell away beneath them. Soon, they were above the clouds, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It was a beautiful view, the kind that people put on postcards. The flight attendant came by. "Champagne, ma'am." Veronica looked at the tall, thin flute glass. The bubbles were rising to the top, popping silently. It was the finest vintage, imported from France. An hour ago, she would have grabbed it instantly. Now, it just looked like colored water. "No," Veronica said, surprising herself, "just water. Plain water, please. With ice." The attendant blinked, confused, but nodded, and hurried away. Veronica turned her gaze to the window again. They were flying east, chasing the night. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned a deep, velvet blue. She stared at her reflection in the glass. She saw a powerful woman. A winner. Someone who had just cheated a breakdown and gotten exactly what she wanted. But the image in the glass seemed like a stranger. She thought about the look on Keanu's face when he told her that old things work when you need them to. He hadn't been angry when she mocked him. He hadn't been defensive. He had just been sure. He knew the value of what he had, and he didn't need her approval to know it was good. That was class, she whispered to herself. She had always thought class was about the price of your shoes or the exclusivity of your club. She thought class was about looking down on people who didn't have what you had. But as the miles ticked by on the digital display above her, she realized she had it backwards. Real class wasn't about making people feel small. Real class was having the power to crush someone and choosing to help them instead. Keanu had every reason to laugh at her. He could have stood there, drinking a bottle of water while her fancy jet sat dead on the runway. He could have taken off and left her there to explain to her board why she missed the meeting. It would have been a great story for him to tell at parties. Instead, he got his hands dirty. He fixed her problem. And then he just walked away. Brian's voice broke her trance. "Miss Sterling, I need you to look at these numbers for the merger. I'm not sure about the third quarter projections." Veronica looked at the glowing screen of his tablet. It was filled with graphs and spreadsheets, numbers representing millions of dollars. Usually, this was where she came alive. This was her battlefield. She looked at the numbers, but they didn't make sense. They just looked like ink on a page. "Not now, Brian," she said, her voice distant. "But the meeting." "The meeting isn't for 5 hours, she said sharply. "I need to think." "Just, let me think." Brian recoiled, pulling the tablet back. He turned away, worried that she was still angry about the delay. Veronica closed her eyes. The hum of the engines was hypnotic. It was too easy to drift off, to forget the heat and the panic and the man with the red box. But she forced herself to remember. She forced herself to hold on to the feeling of being helpless. It was an uncomfortable feeling, but it felt real. For the first time in years, she hadn't been in control. And the world hadn't ended. In fact, something good had happened. A stranger had been kind. She thought about her own tools. Her phone, her computer, her connections, her money. They were all wireless, cloud-based, intangible. If the power went out, if the internet crashed, if the banks failed, who was she? She had no skills, she had no real tools. She just had access. Keanu had the tool. He knew how to use it. That was real power. Somewhere over the Midwest, the attendant brought her water. Veronica took a sip. It was cold and refreshing. She held the cold glass against her forehead, closing her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're welcome, ma'am," the attendant replied. No, Veronica said, opening her eyes and looking out into the darkness. Not you. Just, thank you. The flight continued on, smooth and flawless. The autopilot navigated the turbulence before the passengers could even feel it. It was a marvel of technology, and Veronica was grateful for it. She was glad she didn't have to fly the plane herself. She was glad she could afford to be here. But she knew something had changed. A crack had formed in the shiny veneer of her world. A crack that let the real world shine through. Hours later, the plane began its descent into New York. The city lights spread out below them like a sprawling galaxy of gold and white. It was a sight that always made Veronica feel powerful. This was her kingdom. These were the streets she conquered. The wheels touched down at Teterboro with a soft bump. The pilot reversed the thrusters, and the plane slowed to a taxi. Within minutes, they were parked at the private terminal. A black SUV was waiting on the tarmac, engine idling. The driver was standing by the back door, ready to whisk her away to Manhattan. Everything was exactly as she had ordered it. Everything was perfect. Veronica stood up and smoothed her pantsuit. She grabbed her bag. She was back in business mode. The moment on the tarmac in California felt like a dream, something that had happened in another life. She walked down the stairs, the cool night air of New York hitting her face. It smelled like rain and exhaust. Brian was behind her, nervously checking his watch. "We have to hurry," he said. "Traffic will be bad getting into the city." Veronica stopped at the bottom of the stairs. She was about to get into the back seat of the SUV. But she paused. She looked over at the wing of the jet. The ground crew here was already unloading her luggage. They were efficient and fast. Then, she saw something that made her stop. A young man, one of the baggage handlers, was struggling with a heavy cart. One of the wheels had gotten stuck in a crack in the pavement. He was pushing with all his might, his face red with exertion, but the cart wouldn't budge. The other ground crew members were walking past him, busy with their own tasks, ignoring him. He was just a kid with a stuck cart. A small problem in a big operation. Without thinking, Veronica walked over. Her heels clicked on the pavement. Brian froze, confused. "Ma'am, the car is waiting." "Just a second," Veronica said. She reached the cart. The kid looked up, terrified. He recognized her. "Miss Sterling." I'm sorry, I'll get this moved in a second." Veronica didn't say anything. She set her expensive leather bag on the ground. She grabbed the handle of the cart next to his. She didn't care about her manicure. She didn't care about her suit. "On three," she said. 1, 2, 3. They pulled together. The wheel popped free of the crack. The cart rolled forward smoothly. The kid stared at her, his mouth open. "Thank you." "Wow, thank you so much." Veronica picked up her bag. She looked at the kid, really looked at him. She saw the grease on his hands. She saw the sweat on his forehead. "It happens," she said. She gave him a small, genuine smile. "Have a good night." She turned and walked back to the SUV. She got into the back seat, and Brian closed the door behind her. The car pulled away, merging onto the highway toward the city lights. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" Brian asked from the front seat. He looked completely bewildered. Veronica leaned back against the headrest. She looked out the window at the passing blur of lights. She thought about a red toolbox in a cargo hold. She thought about a stripped screw on a $90 million jet. She thought about the feel of cold metal in her hands. "I'm fine, Brian," she said. "I'm just fine." She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She had a dozen emails, a dozen texts demanding her attention. She pressed the button to turn the screen off. The black glass reflected her face. She wasn't going to check the stock prices. She wasn't going to worry about the meeting. For the first time in a long time, she was just going to sit in the quiet dark of the car and watch the world go by. She was going to remember that no matter how high you fly, or how much money you have, sometimes you just need a good wrench and the will to get your hands dirty. The car sped toward the city, carrying a woman who had learned that the most valuable things in life don't come with a price tag, and the strongest tools are often the ones that look the most broken. She smiled, a real smile this time, and watched the road ahead.